This video tells the harrowing story of the war raging in Sudan from the perspective of Dr. Mohammed El-Krib, a consultant physician who witnessed its onset, stood against it, and continued practicing medicine to alleviate its impact on civilians and internally displaced people until he himself became one of them. Dr. Mohammed El-Krib is the founder of the Mobile Rural Clinic, a charity staffed by a dedicated team of young Sudanese healthcare professionals. The team of the Mobile Rural Clinic toured the villages of Gazira province in central Sudan from the day the organization was founded until the flames of war extended to Wad Madani, the provincial capital of the Gazira region. Wad Madani, better known as Madani, is located some 180 kilometers southeast of the capital, Khartoum. It was in the city of Madani and its twin town across the Blue Nile, Hantub, that the events of this story start unfolding. Madani was also the base of the Mobile Rural Clinic organization, and almost all of the trips conducted by this charity started from there. On Friday, December 15, 2023, the Mobile Rural Clinic was operative in the village of Al-Wali al-Halaween, located about 100 kilometers northwest of the city of Wad Madani. The video captures how that day, beginning with hope and determination, ended in flames, smoke, and unprecedented misery. Through Dr. El-Krib's narrative, the video sheds light on the resilience and dedication of healthcare professionals amidst the chaos of war, highlighting their unwavering commitment to serving their community despite the overwhelming challenges. It also highlights how the innocent people of Sudan are subjected to murderous horror, humiliating displacement, unprecedented theft of their simplest belongings, and a devastating destruction of national resources and future potentials. Stay tuned.
Pain was the title of a post I published on Facebook a few weeks ago. It was a post consisting of a single word. I couldn't add another word at the time. Now I think I am somewhat able to do so. After that, I wrote another post titled, I will tell you about Salma, Mohammed, Ayman, Khalid, and Montasser. These were the team of the Rural Mobile Clinic project. The team continued to work until Friday, mid-December 2023. At the end of that day, the rural clinic stopped, and its team scattered in every direction. A few days, each one worth 60,000 aches passed. I often asked myself, will recounting what happened to me be biased towards my experience over others' experiences? I asked myself, what is the value of my pain compared to what others went through, whose pain no one will write about? These questions tormented me, but I found solace in the fact that when I write about my experience, I, by the very nature of me, and for all good reasons, will also write about others' experiences. Some, if not all of them, are heartbreaking. I will write about the features of that woman in her 50s who asked me on the morning of Tuesday, December 19, 2023, without prior acquaintance, while we were in a yard in the town of Ghanib al-Assad, slightly south of the city of Wad Madani, better known as Madani, in central Sudan. That woman asked me to take her and her companions to where I was going. She was with her mother, 2 daughters, and a small child, and there was only 1 seat left in the car that the hosts had offered me on their journey of displacement. Monday night, December 18th, 2023. The spacious courtyards of our generous host in the previously mentioned town of Ghanib al-Assad had been filled with dozens of displaced people. The courtyards of neighboring houses were also filled with minibuses, trucks, pickups, taxis, tuk-tuks, and motorcycles. The city was emptying all that it had into the paths of exile and displacement. That night, spontaneous and uncounted discussion circles were formed. The news was fresh on the lips of eyewitnesses who kept arriving until the early hours of dawn. However, the most significant piece of news among them all was, Madani has fallen tonight into the hands of the Rapid Support Forces. How? When? Where? The guests in the courtyards of Ghanib al-Assad exchanged dozens of stories that night. The screens of mobile phones continued to glow even after everyone retired to a rest, filled with anxiety. Ironically, One could hear the voices of two war instigators emanating from cell phones here and there, shouting the horrific words of "bull puss," a local expression meaning "kill them without mercy." These two social media activists, each siding with a different war party, kept calling for the war to continue from their safe shelters abroad. No less cowardly, they kept showering the expression of "bull pass" on the ears of the very victims of the same cursed war. Finally, everyone slept, and I still don't know how our generous host managed to provide a bed, food, and a cover for each person. Everyone slept, and the night advanced towards a morning whose features no one could predict. That night in that village was not unique, despite the piercing pain it left behind. It was preceded and followed by many days and nights of unimaginable horror since April 15th, 2023, when the war erupted between two evils in Sudan: the Rapid Support Forces, so named to obscure their terrible past as the infamous Janjaweed, and the political Islamists controlling the top army brass. Innocent Sudanese civilians and soldiers were caught between the two. Saturday morning, December 16th, 2023. That morning, Montaser and I were getting off the bus that had brought us from Al-Hasahisa to the nearest army checkpoint outside the city of Wad Madani. We couldn't enter the city, which seemed just a stone's throw away. On our way to Madani, the sound of shelling grew closer and closer. By the time we reached the last checkpoint, Montaser and I couldn't even talk to each other. Shells were flying over the river from Hantub to Madani, and from Madani to Hantub every minute, while the sky bombarded the ground and the ground bombarded the sky. The soldiers at the checkpoint informed us that we couldn't advance any further toward Madani. Our only option was to detour via the railway line, reaching the city from its far west, crossing empty land until we reached a canal parallel to the railway line. However, when we got there, we encountered a hastily set up checkpoint and had no choice but to return the way we came. Some young men carrying long-distance travel bags joined us on the road. They said they were from the city of Atbara and were on their way to meet their families at the town of Al-Hajj Abdallah, but the attack on Madani had blocked their path. We took refuge under a zinc-roofed shelter in the courtyard of a mosque by the side of the road, west of the Kombo Halima checkpoint. Kombo Halima is a collection of huts and shelters where the soldiers had set up their last checkpoint. Montaser and I used our hand luggage as pillows and lay down under the zinc roof of the mosque shelter, with shells flying over our heads and across the river. My mind was focused on crossing the river to Hantub, where my home, my large family, and my closest relatives were. The Central Reserve Station fell near the trauma hospital in Hantub. Montaser reported after a phone call with his brother, a sergeant. "Can we swim across the river?" I asked him. He paused for a moment, then replied that the RSF had undoubtedly stationed snipers on the riverbank on Hantub side. The intermittent phone calls I managed to make with my sister in Hantub reported that empty shell casings were falling into our home's yard and the yards of our neighbors. My mind stopped working entirely. How will my family, my mother, sisters, and other relatives get out of Hantub? How will I cross the river that I had crossed thousands of times before? There were no answers. Salma's messages, resembling crossword puzzles, indicated that she had finally reached her home in the town of Masad, a bit west of Madani. Salma is a young doctor at the beginning of her career and one of the pillars of the rural mobile clinic team. She, along with Montaser, the skilled nurse, Ayman, the capable lab specialist, and Khalid, the engineer, now a driver after being displaced from Khartoum. Few months earlier, Khalid reported that he was still looking for gasoline for his car. Khalid, as I mentioned earlier, was the driver of the small car that took us to the village of Al-Wali al-Halawin on Friday morning for what would become the last day. The price of a gallon of gasoline shot to nearly £100,000 that day. Khalid didn't know where he would go after getting the gasoline. We left Ayman at our clinic in Al-Hasahisa, tasked with packing up our equipment and keeping it safe in his town slightly south of Al-Hasahisa. Montaser and I were on the ground under a zinc roof next to the last impossible crossing point to Madani at Kombo Halima. At that moment, the fates of the rural mobile clinic team were sealed. Just 2 hours earlier, everything had been completely different. Friday dawn, December 15th, 2023. I woke up after a comfortable sleep at around 5 in the morning on Friday, which coincided with the middle of the last month of 2023. Half an hour later, I had a light breakfast and went out to the spacious courtyard of our house with a cup of tea with milk in hand. The garden birds, we have a beautiful garden in a large area of the house yard, greeted me as they do every morning with their loud celebration of light, sun, and life. Only 15 minutes had passed when Montaser arrived on his motorcycle from the village of Al-Shokaba, crossing all of the city of Madani and then the Hantub bridge to my house. He informed me that Khalid was waiting in his small car outside. Khalid would be a member of the team that day because my Chinese-made BYD car was with the mechanic, as it often was, for some repair. Since his displacement from Khartoum, Khalid's car had been both his source of income and his home. I went back to prepare a cup of tea for Khalid and asked Montaser to make himself breakfast in the kitchen. That morning was serene, bright, and beautiful at that moment, and no one imagined it wouldn't be so in just a few hours. We set off around 6 to meet Dr. Salma, who was coming from the town of Masad at an intersection with Madani Khartoum highway few miles away. Then Ayman, who was waiting at another intersection further north, before continuing to our clinic in the city of Al-Hasahisa to pick up our equipment. From there, we would be heading slightly northwest to the destination of our rural clinic that morning, the village of Al-Wali Al-Halawin. A cheerful atmosphere immediately took over once the team was complete inside Khalid's white car, brand named Click. The playful banter began between Montaser and Salma, and various discussions ensued between Khalid and Ayman until we reached what we used to call the neem tree of Haja Khadija, one of the tea vendors on the outskirts of Al-Hasahisa, where we usually stop for coffee and bakumba, a local breakfast receipt. The beginning of the day was as serene as the morning, and no one knew that this would be the last peaceful day in those surroundings. Saturday afternoon, December 16th, 2023. I left you while I was with Montaser, was stranded on the floor of the mosque shelter by the road near Kombo Halima, with shells flying over our heads across the river. It was approaching 1 o'clock in the afternoon when one of the young men from the displaced people of Atbara informed us that the checkpoint at the head of the canal mentioned earlier had been abandoned and that the road now seemed clear towards the west of Madani along the railway line. We all got up immediately and crossed the empty gullied land again in another attempt to cross. The checkpoint was empty of soldiers this time, but as soon as we reached Kombo Halima, we were warmly greeted by an old man from the Fulani community living in the area. His sons quickly brought us water to drink and a traditional bed, angarib, and placed it on the canal bank among the huts. "Drink, my sons, drink. Where are you going with under this fire?" he asked. "And we are going to Madani, Faki Abakar," that was his name. "And where? Madani? No, don't go to Madani. Madani? No, in the name of God, don't go to Madani," he said repeatedly. "And why Faki Abakar?" we asked. "My son, haven't you heard? Shells are flying everywhere. And now my son Musab just arrived and said the police bridge is under heavy fire," he replied. "And I am also going to Hantub," I said. "Hantub? No. Hantub is death, straight up death," he fearfully repeated. Faki Abakar did not let us cross to Madani. That moment, he was a father to us, with fear in his eyes for us, for the city, and with love and tears. We sat on the angaribs, a Sudanese name for a bed made of ropes and local wood by the canal, and had an impromptu meeting without any plan, agenda, or appointment between Montaser and me, and with Faki Abakar and the displaced people from Atbara. The unspoken question among us all was, what to do? Morning and day of Friday, December 15th, 2023. The activity of the rural mobile clinic that morning in the village of Wali Al-Halawin began with the enthusiasm of the team and the welcoming of our people who awaited us in the dozens. The day started with the usual meeting and interactive discussion with those present about everything related to diabetes. Comments and questions came from here and there, reflecting an interest and eagerness that always delighted me in every similar activity the team conducted in dozens of villages visited by the rural clinic across the Greenbelt and its surroundings. Montasser and Salma started arranging the clinic's setup as soon as I finished talking with my patients in the health center courtyard. Ayman, along with the local staff, prepared the lab, and an hour and a half later, Salma and I began receiving our first patients, and the work proceeded as usual. We paused for a while to have a meal insisted upon by the villagers, and, as usual, our generous hosts provided us with delicious Sudanese dishes. After that, we returned to work. The clinic proceeded smoothly, interrupted only by few medical emergencies, and the day quickly advanced into the afternoon and early evening, when I noticed Khalid standing at the clinic's door, holding his phone and signaling for me to come out. Fear was evident in his eyes despite the few meters between us. It was very unusual for Khalid to interrupt our work unless if it was something very serious happening, and it was indeed more serious than I ever thought. Madani is being attacked by the RSF, doctor, he said. What? I asked. The militia is attacking Madani from the east, he replied. Before Khalid could go further, my sister called from Hantub to confirm what he said. Montasser, too, received the same news from his friends. Outside, the news was on everyone's lips. The militia in Rafah, someone said. No, they're in town, of Abu Haraz, another person argued. They're attacking the fuel depots in the village of Alayla. No, the army hit them on the move. No, no one confronted them. They crossed the Rahad bridge. No, the army bombed the bridge. They gathered and crossed the Rahad from the Fage bridge. They're attacking Rafah now. No, they're still in Abu Haraz. The fighters bombed them. No, they are advancing. They're not more than 10 trucks. No, more than that. The frantic comments went on and on. Continuing work was no longer possible. We headed towards Al-Hasahisa around 5 in the evening, finding the city at the mercy of rumors. However, the confirmed news was the city of Madani is under attack from the east. The road between Al-Hasahisa and Madani was closed to traffic, and we had nowhere to spend the night except at Ayman's house in his town a little south of Al-Hasahisa. The exhaustion of the day, which started very early, had begun to take its toll, but anxiety left no room for any negligence. We spent the night in the hospitality of Ayman and his generous family. In the early morning, everything, even the dawn breeze, indicated that things would never be the same again. Morning, day, evening, and early night of Saturday, December 16, 2023. We had to get to Hantub by any means, but the road to Madani was unsafe and Khalid's car had run out of gas. Ayman was trying to reassure us that Madani wouldn't fall and that we would continue our work there soon. Khalid, however, wasn't as confident, based on his experience in Khartoum. Montasser was attempting to contact anyone he knew, and his friends in the town of Abu Haraz, 10 kilometers east of Madani, informed him that dozens of armed trucks were heading towards the town Hantub. Hantub is the town where I was born and have lived ever since. It's where my father built our home, which has become the residence for our extended family. Hantub is separated from the city of Madani only by the Blue Nile, with the famous Hantub-Madani bridge connecting the two. Many residents of Hantub, my sister told me over the phone, crossed the bridge towards Madani in the early hours of dawn before the bombing intensified. Salma said she would take any bus towards her town, which could be reached by an alternate route. Montasser, Khalid, and I arranged transportation for Salma, then bid farewell to Khalid, who needed to find gas for his car by any means. Montasser, Ayman, and I stood on the street, absorbing the news. Traveling to the city of Madani was impossible at that moment, as traffic had turned one way northward. We took a bus back to Al-Hasahisa, hoping to find transportation from there to Madani through the side roads. After about an hour, we arrived back at our clinic. I knew I was preparing for my last day at the clinic. Morning, day, evening, and early night of Saturday, December 16th, 2023. I bought some bread, fruit, and green salad from a shop outside the clinic, then headed to the bus stop with Montasser. This time, we found a daring driver who agreed to take us to Madani, but only as far as Campo Halima checkpoint. We agreed immediately, and the bus set off towards Madani, its doors closed, past Campo Halima. Afternoon and evening of Saturday, December 16th, 2023. The meeting continued on the banks of the canal, with Fakir Abkar's presence for a little more than half an hour. It was a silent meeting except for Fakir Abakar's pleas after not going to Madani, "Oh, my children." The meeting ended with Montasser receiving a phone call from his brother, an army sergeant, informing him that he would pass by the checkpoint in about an hour on his way to Al-Hasahisa, where his colleagues promised him a jerrycan of gasoline so they could transport their families to Sinar. Montasser's brother said he would come in a small red car branded in Sudan by the name Atus, and we had to wait for him at the checkpoint. To me, that conversation between Montasser and his brother meant that the fall of Madani was imminent, offering me the narrowest window of time to get through the checkpoint with the help of Montasser's brother, before attempting to cross the river at night when the shelling usually halts. Our meeting ended at Campo Halima, and Faki Abakar breathed a sigh of relief. We bid him farewell warmly and returned on foot, myself, Montasser, and the displaced people from the city of Atbara, once again to the checkpoint. It was around 2 in the afternoon, and the morning chill had turned into scorching midday heat, intensifying the shimmer of the shelling bombarding on the lush green banks of the Blue Nile. We reached the checkpoint, crossing the open space between it and Campo Halima, waiting under the blazing winter sun of Sudan for the arrival of a rival Montasser's brother in the small red car, the Atus. At around 3 o'clock, Montasser's brother arrived with his uncle. We joined them, and the red Atus headed north towards Al-Hasahisa, a place I was destined to visit for the 3rd time that day. Inside the red Atus, I was convinced by the atmosphere and conversations that Madani would not be the same. I also felt, portably for the first time, that this might be a multi-party war. The car was completely worn out, and its fuel was running low, so it was no surprise when it came to a complete halt in the town of Al-Ayakura, halfway to Al-Hasahisa. Montasser's brother hitched a ride in another car towards Al-Hasahisa to get fuel, while the rest of us, myself, Montasser, and their relative, waited inside the car. It was then that I remembered we hadn't eaten since last night. I also remembered that I had a loaf of bread and a salad that the 3 of us had shared, along with water from a nearby well on the other side of the road. Morning, day, evening, and early night of Saturday, December 16th, 2023. After about 2 hours, Montasser's brother arrived with the awaited jerrycan of fuel. He poured about a gallon into the tank of the worn-out red Atus, and its engine sputtered to life. Once again, we turned south towards Madani, but we hadn't covered a quarter of the distance when we encountered a commotion and shouting on the side of the road. The red Atus slowed down as we approached, and to our surprise, we saw 2 individuals on the ground, bound, surrounded by dozens of people in a state of extreme agitation. One of them wielded a leather whip and rushed into the crowd, assaulting one person after another, while some tried to restrain him. In the vicinity, military clothing could be seen, undoubtedly belonging to these 2 men. Damia Damia, meaning members of the Rapid Support Force, someone in the crowd shouted. Montasser's brother stopped the Atus and got out to assess the situation. I followed suit, as did Montasser, and we approached the scene. It turned out that the 2 men were none other than the soldiers who had stopped us earlier at the Campo Halima checkpoint during our initial attempt to reach Madani in the morning. We tried to clarify the situation, but no one listened to us. We returned to our car to resume our journey to Madani. We arrived at the checkpoint and passed through it, this time thanks to Montasser's brother, a non-commissioned officer. The red Atus rumbled towards the entrance of the city. It was around 6:30 in the evening, but that evening was not an ordinary one. It was a wound. It was destruction. It was darkness and despair. The red Atus turned left at the intersection near the rehabilitative hospital, heading towards the Hanatub Bridge. To our left stood the complex of the University of Jazeera, Neshishiba, while houses of the Al-Andalus neighborhood lined the streets to our right. There was no movement between the houses, silence engulfed the city, and darkness loomed. The emptiness descended upon the city, spreading like a shroud between the houses. I felt that if I were to take it out of the car window, I would feel it. Emptiness, nothingness, palpable death. We reached the entrance of Hantub Bridge from the direction of Madani. At first, we couldn't see anything, but after a moment, ghosts emerged from the shadows. Soldiers, with rifles slung over their shoulders and weapons in their hands, appeared. Montas's brother approached them, identifying himself, while I got out of the car to ask about the possibility of crossing the bridge to Hantub. At that moment, Montas's panicked relative, who had accompanied us, entered a state of terror at the frightening scene. I had to return to the car to calm him down, but he was in such a state of fear that he could barely move, and if it weren't for mine and Montaser's restraint, he might have jumped out of the truck and run. The soldiers explained to us that crossing the bridge was impossible, even though the shelling had stopped at night, because snipers on the Hantub side targeted anything moving on the bridge or swimming in the Nile. It became clear that I wouldn't be able to cross to Hantub. My companions had their own concerns that night. Therefore, we had no choice but to turn back towards the city. But a city that we saw, and what a night that was. What streets were these? What a desolation. What an agony was it, and what a darkness. The city displayed nothing but fear, anticipation, and shadows. We traveled down the old tanning factory road, then turned left towards the tomb of Wad Madani al-Sunni, after which the city was named, and then south towards the Malid Square. We didn't encounter anyone, not even stray dogs. When we reached the industrial school, I asked to get out of the Red Atus, intending to visit a friend's house there. I knew that Montasser and his brother would continue their journey to the town of Al-Shokaba, south of Madani, and if I continued with them, I wouldn't be able to re-enter Madani. Fortunately, my friend and his family were at home. The bombing had stopped with the onset of night, and like the rest of the city's residents, my friend had no concept of what might happen tomorrow. Another night passed, filled with anxiety, frantic communications among people, exchanging news, and questions for which there were no answers. Dawn of Sunday, December 17th, 2023. We woke up to the sound of explosions at dawn, our sleep interrupted. It was clear to me that I wouldn't be able to cross the bridge to Hantub, so all efforts focused on getting my mother, sisters, and whoever was with them out of there. Their only way out was east, towards the cities of Al-Gadarif and Kassala, from directly eastwards from Hantub. This meant crossing the firing line set up east of the Hantub bridge. It meant passing through the Rapid Support Forces checkpoints. All this while, the bombardment continued relentlessly. I found one of my friend's relatives from the town of Abu Haraz, which had been one of the first stations for the Rapid Support Forces since Friday morning. His communications with his family there indicated that the entire town had evacuated west towards the Nile, leaving the rest of the village facing the road in the hands of the Rapid Support Forces. The situation there was indescribable. The calls were intermittent, and anxiety and fear dominated every moment. The terrifying bombardment continued throughout the day and into the early night. Afternoon of Sunday, December 17th, 2023. The bombardment was more intense than ever. Reports indicated that the attack was now concentrated on the eastern outskirts of Hantub, and shells were falling inside residential areas, including our house. Leaving there had become a matter of life or death. I hadn't slept a single moment throughout the previous night, trying with my sisters there to figure out how to get out. Around 9 o'clock, the 2 vehicles that we possess in Hantub had been prepared, and 2 of my nephews were ready to drive them through the fire towards Al-Gadarif and Kassala. I turned off my phone, knowing that any call to them would complicate the situation when they were inevitably stopped by the Janjaweed. 2 hours passed of stormy, relentless anxiety. 2 hours, and it was now 3:30. My hand was on the phone to make a call, as I guessed they must have crossed the fire lines, but the phone rang before I could dial. I found myself listening to my niece, my cousin's daughter, speaking to me from Dubai, telling me that her grandmother, mother, aunt, and whoever was with them had safely made it out of danger and were now secure. The cloud of anxiety lifted like a heavy fog, replaced instantly with the weariness of the world. My niece asked me what I would do now that I would be alone in the Madani, and I told her I would go to sleep. And indeed, I fell into a deep sleep after 2.5 days of sleepless vigilance that had frayed my nerves. Evening and night of Sunday, December 17th, 2023. I woke up to the sounds of gunfire, screams, and cheers. For a moment, I couldn't discern where I was or what was happening. To remind you, I was still at my friend's house in Madani. I went out to the veranda, asking those who were there, and they told me that there were reports suggesting that the army had triumphed. I stepped out onto the street to find the whole city celebrating. I returned indoors, convinced that someone was orchestrating something that couldn't be innocent. The collapse of the Janjaweed, based on what I had experienced firsthand, was something that shouldn't have happened within a matter of hours. Moreover, the sounds of passing shells from east to west still echoed in my ears. Some people started calling from Sinar, the biggest city south of the city of Madani, asking about the possibility of returning to Madani, and hesitation set in among those who were planning to flee. Some neighbors came to the house, and one of them came out with an analysis suggesting that the Kizan, a derogatory term for the Islamist groups and militias within the army, were deceiving people for some purpose. A heavy night descended, bringing back the vigil, and with it, the exhausting storms of contemplation. Morning of Monday, December 18th, 2023. We woke up to the terrifying sounds of shelling. So, the news from last night turned out to be false. The morning shells proved it. It was now clear, and the inevitable had come. I must evacuate my beloved city. I checked the validity of my passport and counted the remaining pounds. I cast one last glance at the details of the house that hosted me during these nights of pain, then ventured out onto the street. There was no means of transportation available. The city that celebrated last night was now entirely leaving, heading south on trucks, cars, carts, and even by foot. Montasir called from his village, Shokaba, saying his family had left for Singar, another city further south, leaving him alone there. I told him I was on my way. Shortly after, he called again to inform me that the army had withdrawn, and the Janjaweed were now crossing the bridge in hundreds. I took to the road on foot, walking down the railway station street toward the central market. It wasn't long before a friend stopped me and told me he wouldn't leave the city. He was one of a kind, but he did move his family to safety a few days back. We chatted briefly not far from my house, where I spotted some of my very close relatives, in a state of terror, riding in a Hyundai car branded as Santa Fe. I approached them, and after a short conversation, they offered me a seat in the car. They were on their way to the town of Ghanib al-Assad, just south of Madani, where they would stay with other relatives until things settled. These relatives of mine had never lived anywhere but Madani. I didn't want to share with them my view, which would distress them as it did me, that our beloved city would never be the same after being deceived by the entrenched army and violated by the Janjaweed. And so the Santa Fe set off south toward what wouldn't be the last destination. Monday night, December 18th, 2023. As we journeyed south, Khalid called and informed us he was in Fadasi, a small town just north of Madani, and had obtained petrol but didn't know where he would go after the Janjaweed invaded Madani. I had no answer. Moments later, Montasir called, asking me to wait for him at the crossing point to the south, a little beyond his village, Shokaba. In my mind, he would join me on the way to Ghanib al-Assad village, so we could continue our journey together south to Sinar. I just wanted to keep my team members together for as long as possible, knowing we were now parting ways. Throughout the journey, the retreating army's convoys raced past civilian vehicles, showered by curses from the people for handing over the city without a real fight. The lie of yesterday's victory was still fresh, and its deceitful stab was bleeding profusely. We reached the checkpoint southward, where the usual presence of security forces was absent. Instead, its gates were widely open toward the south. I met Montasir, who welcomed us with cold water crystals and phone credit vouchers. He informed me that Salma's family had left for their relatives living in safer places further west. I bid him to join me tomorrow to where I would spend my night in Ghanib al-Assad village. We arrived there around 7 p.m., where our host warmly welcomed us into his spacious home. The house and its courtyards quickly filled with people, while outside, trucks transported goods from the city's stores to its new headquarters. Our host stood proudly, overseeing his guests' comfort, while his children and their children carried trays of food and tea for dozens of guests. The news of the city's fall was renewed with each newcomer, tales were told, and news sources fed them. Above all, in the vast courtyard, questions hung in the air, and on its sky, destinies swayed. That night, countless discussion circles formed, with no end in sight. December 19th, 2023. Today marked the anniversary of the glorious revolution's beginning, the uprising that has brought down the dictator Omar al-Bashir 4 years back. I couldn't help but curse everyone who diverted its course to the scene I witnessed and testified to, then narrated. For those who are just starting to read my posts, it is to remind you of the scene of that lady, with tears in her eyes, pleading for me to take her, her mother, and whoever was with them to where I was going. However, there was no room available in the car I was traveling in, even if I had left my seat for her. Those who were with me hesitated to go, but they soon understood the situation when they learned that our host in Ghanib al-Assad village was preparing himself and his family to flee to Sinnar. I contemplated the scene in the vast courtyard that morning. Dozens of vehicles were packing up, their roofs stacked with bags and crates tied to iron bars, containing children, mothers with fear in their eyes, along with questions. Sinnar was the destination. My family awaited me there tonight. What a return it would be, Mohammed Abdel Hayy. Mohammed Abdel Hayy was a famous poet with a poem named Back to Sinnar, and I was quoting the expression, "My family awaited me there tonight" from that poem. I asked Mohammed, my relative and the owner of the Santa Fe car, to take the car outside in preparation for evacuation due to the congestion of vehicles in the courtyard. However, he hesitated before agreeing. Mohammed, his brother, and his sisters, as I've mentioned before, had no place in their lives other than Medani. In their minds, Ghanib al-Assad village was the farthest possible place to flee. I knew that telling them the reality won't be easy, but I had to be the fleet commander now. So, as calmly as possible, I explained to him that we were leaving and that Ghanib al-Assad village itself would likely be in the hands of the Janjaweed within hours. But he wasn't in a state to comprehend what I was saying. I left him temporarily and engaged in conversation with some neighbors, all of whom had taken their families to safer villages in the south. Less than an hour passed before one of them came running to inform us that Rapid Support Forces, Janjaweed, were on the outskirts of the village, and some had already cut off the road connecting the village to the Medani-Sinnar highway. Just like the characters in the famous story of by Bushra al-Fadil, a famous Sudanese writer, the gathering dispersed around me. And just like the wind, Mohammed the Santa Fe car owner, with fear in his eyes, drove the Santa Fe rushing back into the courtyard. And I found myself alone, staring at the street towards the Janjaweed's vehicles. Late morning and noon of Tuesday, December 19th, 2023. The Janjaweed patrols began to move with swaying and circling near the outskirts of the village for some time before disappearing from my sight, returning to the highway. I realized that they were scouting the southern entrance of the city, and that, at least for the time being, they were not in an attacking position, but they would certainly establish a deployment point at the crossing station south of the city where the checkpoint used to be. This led me to the conclusion that the wisest decision at the moment is to leave towards the Medani-Sinnar road from the south of the village, away from the barricade, to avoid that crossing point. I had to exert pressure, rough this time, to get my relatives, who were still hesitating, out of the situation. And, as you remember, they were the owners of the Santa Fe car. Staying meant exposing themselves to what forced them to leave their home in the first place. This time, they just followed my orders. They knew that the families of our host are also fleeing south. Our numbers filled the Santa Fe, and with my directions, the car set off through the village's trails towards a road that would take us south and then west to reach the highway, away from the Janjaweed stronghold, which I imagined at the crossing point north of the village. My intuition was right, because after maneuvering behind the village, through the plains and the cow pens, we arrived amidst the bustling traffic to the Sennar Road, which Mohammed, the driver, turned onto like a magnet, attracting iron filings. I looked at Mohammed and found his eyes, naturally sunken, almost bulging out of their sockets, and his hands had become part of the steering wheel. I searched for a paper tissue in my pocket and wiped the sweat from his forehead, and suddenly he looked at me and said, "They're kicking them out of their homes unjustly." At that moment, pain and sorrow wrestled within me, but despite everything, an irresistible urge to laugh emerged. For Mohammed, whose whole world was Madani and his home, and whose life revolved around it, was not aided by that moment except by this verse of Quran that he didn't even remember well. And so, our displacement from Madani began. The bumpy and disfigured highway to Sinnar couldn't have been slower back then, as it had to bear the weight of the entire city. Every vehicle, from the largest to the smallest, crawled along, and every bump and deep hole tested its resilience. All kinds of vehicles, from the largest trucks to the smallest bicycles, and among them were rickshaws, tuk-tuks, and bicycles carrying mothers and grandmothers, pushed by children and grandchildren on foot. Afternoon and evening of Tuesday, December 19th, 2023. The journey to Sinnar, normally no more than 2 hours, took about 6 full hours. We weren't driving, but rather crawling, and often I would leave the car, the Santa Fe, to walk for a while until the car caught up with me. Along the way, I met one of my friends whom I had treated for a severe tissue inflammation in one of his legs just a week ago. Now, I found this friend with the same inflamed leg, driving his rickshaw, gathering his wife and children, all displaced to Sinnar. We also encountered many acquaintances, some of whom had run out of fuel and were stranded on the side of the road. The 6 hours passed before we reached the outskirts of Sinnar, passing through towns like Al-Hajj Abdullah and Wad al-Haddad, which took over an hour each to pass due to the congestion caused by trucks and vehicles packed with dozens of people and loaded with all imaginable furniture, bags, mattresses, and crates. We arrived at the crossing point at the entrance of the city of Sinnar, where they redirected all displaced traffic southward, away from the highway, to another road that ran parallel to the Nile, leading to the southern bridge. 2 hours of agony ensued, exacerbated by the gridlock caused by hundreds of cars and other vehicles crossing the dirt road along the Nile. We progressed slowly towards the bridge, with muddy fine dust, locally named the Farnaga, advancing before us, with us, and behind us. 2 hours later, we reached the entrance of the bridge, which the Santa Fe struggled to climb the incline leading to it before we crossed the Blue Nile, and the road opened up to the east from Sinnar towards the Medani El Gedaref Road, eastward at the intersection of the Kayari Bridge, slightly west of the city of Fao. The distance to there was mostly on a deserted road, and now we were about to experience the Farnaga of the east, after having experienced the Farnaga of the west a little while ago. At that moment, 8 hours had passed since we left behind the village of Kanab al-Assad, and 2 days were nearing completion since we left our city. But the exit from the Sinnar Bridge on the eastern bank of the Nile, before we meet the Farnaga, was nothing like the latter. It was a greenery shimmering under the setting sun, with mango orchards and orange groves. Those few moments when my eyes were filled with the greenery of those banks were like the taste of cold water in the noon of thirst and heat, and it was like the taste of wellness after a severe illness. But more sincere and painful than all of that was the scent of my country, which I loved and longed for, forced to leave it behind. I struggled to hold back my tears, knowing I was responsible for the tears of those with me, and aware that more tears were still to come. Tuesday night, December 19th, 2023. I asked Bakri, my relative and now the other driver of the Santa Fe, to stop in the first village east of Sinar, as we were all in desperate need of a wash, especially the two girls, Mohammed's and Bakri's sisters. Bakri veered left towards one of those villages, and at its entrance, we found dozens of young men carrying containers of cold water, thermoses of tea and coffee, and most importantly, open hearts and homes. The young men volunteered to accompany us to one of the houses, while others hurried to open the doors, and the ladies of the house welcomed the girls. I, a bit later, knew that village by the name of Helta El Sharif Bijubub, and in that village, and in all the villages along that road, humanity, hospitality, and warmth greeted us at the entrances. Some even set up tents with chairs inside, filled with food and drinks. Immediately, the stark contrast between the brutality of the Kezans and the Janjaweed and the kindness and beauty of those welcoming us on the deserted road, inviting us into their hearts before their homes, became clear to me. After an hour and a half, we reached the Doba Bridge on the Dinder River. The Dinder River, what a river that was, what a wilderness and what a beauty. How did we ignore all of that, and how much this land offered us, all to be just passing unnoticed. I asked Bakri to stop, and I crossed the bridge on foot, admiring the wild beauty of that ancient river. Its deep channel and sharp-edged rocks adorned its green banks, shining under the fading evening light and the headlights of passing vehicles. We had all that, yet we only knew sidewalks, cement prisons, and forests of iron. The road from Doba Bridge on the Dinder River to the town of Kayari on the Medani El Gedaref highway eastward was about 50 kilometers long, but it would take us no less than 3 hours to cover. Not only because the road was unpaved, but also because of the cursed Farnagas, and the latter would intensify with the passage of dozens, if not hundreds, of displaced vehicles heading east. The darkness had descended, and the road's features were outlined by the swirling dust storms around the vehicles ahead of us and those following us. The journey's weight did not lighten, and its silence was only broken by our occasional arrival at a village along the way, where its youth greeted us with cold water, tea, coffee, and food. Around 10 o'clock, the lights of the town of Kayari, located west of Alfao, on the Medani El Gedaref highway, finally appeared. Once again, we were welcomed by dozens of locals with greetings, expressions of gratitude for our safety, and offerings of food and drink. Standing on the roadside, I looked westward towards Medani and Hantub, resisting a strong urge to travel west towards my towns and cities of memory. The distance there did not exceed 50 kilometers, less than an hour on a paved road. Yet here I was, arriving after a full day and half a night, embarking on a journey whose end I did not know, on a road that would lead me once again to the sidewalks of estrangement and the cities of dispersion. We headed east towards El Gedarif, stopping intermittently in rest areas in towns like Alfao, Al-Qudmubliya, and Al-Mughrih, to rest a little from the travails of travel and the gloom of the scenery over a cup of tea or coffee, and to exchange stories of displacement, grief, and tragedy with dozens of other displaced people. We reached the outskirts of El Gedarif at dawn, and in the meantime I had been in contact with some of relatives there, finding myself torn between the homes where everyone had offered their hospitality so generously. After an hour of confusion, we arrived at the home of one of our relatives in the Helta al-Malik neighborhood on the outskirts of El Gedarif, the eastern edge. The sun was about to rise, heralding the start of the 20th day of December in the year 2023 since the birth of Christ. Dawn, an early morning of Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. Everyone immediately surrendered to deep sleep, but I searched for a jug, water, and soap. I soaked my pants and shirt, which I had been wearing since early Friday morning, then succumbed to a nap resembling a fever dream. When I felt a slight itch in my neck, I found myself only in my underwear. I woke up after 2 hours, finding myself under a warm blanket while my clothes hung on the line, emanating the scent of cleanliness. Before me on a small table was a tray with tea and baked goods. Daylight of Wednesday, December 20th, 2023. The rest of the guests woke up and planning for the trip to Kassala began. The absence of gasoline in Medani was available at the pumps in Gedarif, and the road to Kassala was better than any we had traveled so far. My mother, sisters, and the rest of the displaced people from Hantub had preceded us to Kassala, temporarily staying at the house of a family friend before continuing the journey to Port Sudan. We stopped at the Shuk station for breakfast and engaged in conversations with fellow refugees who had gathered there. I had worked in these areas during my early career and knew them well, including all the refugee camps around the city. "Hey, doctor!" The call was loud and the voice was familiar despite the passing years. "Othman Kir?" "Yes, it's me," and we embraced. Othman Kir was one of my close friends from my days working at UNHCR in the city. He worked for the organization Care Sudan, hence his nickname, Othman Kir. We exchanged memories, and during the brief moment of our encounter, Othman Kir reminded me of something I had said to him 30 years ago, just a few days after Bashir's coup. I had told him that the coup by the Kizan would plunge us into a nightmare. "Did you know by Allah?" Othman Kir asked me. Their appearance was written all over their faces, Othman, and it still is. Othman laughed and said, "Oh, I see. And what's happening now?" I replied that what happened back then was indeed a nightmare, as I had anticipated, but what is happening now is even worse. Othman laughed again before asking me, "Where is—" "I don't know, honestly." "What do you mean you don't—" "Yes, why?" "I don't know, Othman, only God knows." This time Othman didn't laugh. I bid him farewell and the Santa Fe SUV headed towards Kassala. Wednesday evening and night, December 20th, 2023. It was around 8 o'clock p.m. when the silhouette of the hill Taka materialized in the horizon, indicating our nearing of the city of Kassala. Kassala has always been linked to beauty reflected in many Sudanese poems and songs, and indeed, this city laying in the foot of the hill Tika and traversed by the river Algash was once so beautiful. It took about an hour to reach the house where the friends of my relatives, my companions, would host them. The people of the house welcomed us warmly, typical of the people of Kassala. They hosted me for dinner before taking me to where my family was staying. My sister Amal greeted me outside the house with tears. Amal was the most affected by our leaving our home in Hantub because she was the only one among us who stayed there. Her work as a teacher and then a school principal was mostly there, and after retiring, she became the lady of the house, keeping it open to people, relatives, and guests just like before. I reassured myself about my mother and the rest of my family. The people of the house we stayed in for 4 days were truly welcoming, and their home was comfortable, warm, and generous. Thursday morning, December 21st, 2023, I bought some clothes for myself from Kassala market as I only had the pants and shirt I washed in Kedarif. I checked the simple belongings my family had brought, most importantly the laptop, which, without it, I wouldn't be able to write what I'm writing now. I forgot to mention that my iPhone, which I was using, had become mute since the day when Montasser and I wandered between Kombu Halima and the checkpoint last Saturday morning. Days passed, Friday 22nd, Saturday 23rd, Sunday 24th, and Monday 25th of December 2023. Those days in Kassala have passed. I met dear friends Mustafa and Yasser one evening. And so passed those days in Kassala. Others came from the families and friends of those who hosted us in Kassala, along with their stories about that week of pain. And so passed those days in Kassala. I went to Taka Hills drinking from the water of stream pond of Tutiel, hoping to return one day. And so passed those days in Kassala. I visited those I could locate among family and friends, exchanged conversations and hearing stories. And so passed those days in Kassala. Takka Hills, River Kash Tutiel streams, and River Dinder. And so passed those days in Kassala Salma, Ayman, Khaled, and Montasser. Camp Halima, and the tears of Faki Abkar. And so passed those days in Kasala Mustafa al-Qurashi and the sweetness of Al-Halwain, Wad al-Kabir and Shanig, the rural clinic and the Nile on our left, the rural clinic and the Nile on our right, and so passed those days in Kasala work, poetry, enthusiasm, family, friends, and so passed those days in Kasala Medani, Hantub Bridge, the hospitals and clinics, my patients, and so passed those days in Kasala, this checkpoint, that checkpoint, the thundering sounds of shelling and the soothing sounds of birds, and so passed those days in Kasala, and those days passed in Kasala. Tuesday, December the 26th, 2023. Our convoy moved to Port Sudan at 7 in the morning. My mother, one of my sisters, Mohammed, and I were in an ambulance, while the rest were in my sister's Tuscan car. The journey took about 6 hours until we reached the town of Haya. The road was not a road, but rather a series of potholes, with patches of worn-out asphalt. We passed through the town of Hadalia. What a beautiful name. But the town was nothing more than a collection of miserable shacks, covered with pieces of tattered cloth. There was no sign of modernity, except for the railway lines stretching far away like an old promise, waiting to be fulfilled by no one. I saw poverty and deprivation manifested before my tired eyes. After 2 hours, we reached the town of Aroma, which was no better than Hadalia. Finally, we arrived in the city of Haya, where the first military checkpoints appeared. We rested briefly and then continued on the long road, which became better after about an hour when we passed through the town of Jebet. The road then ascended, winding around the mountains until we reached Al-Aqaba, where the checkpoints multiplied before the road stretched out to Swakin. Night had fallen by then, and finally the lights of Port Sudan greeted us, welcoming the city after numerous checkpoints around 10 o'clock at night. Tuesday night and Wednesday dawn, December 26, 27, 2023. I wandered a little in the streets of Port Sudan, and immediately I was overcome by a mixed feeling. This city was once beautiful. How? How could it happen that I only visit it in these circumstances? How can it be just a transit point to leave the country? What does Borhan, the new dictator of the war-torn Sudan, want from you? What does the runaway general from his leadership want from you? A lonely and gloomy feeling accompanied me from my short stay in Port Sudan. This city does not deserve to be a capital of war, no matter which party made it their headquarters, but does Khartoum deserve it? Does Medani and Hantub deserve it? Does Nyala, El Fasher, and El Dain deserve it? Does the river Dinder and the river Rahad deserve it? Once again, the lush mango gardens on the banks of the Nile, east of Sinar, appeared before my eyes. And once again, the wild beauty of the river Dinder, flowing alone under the bridge, painfully hit me like an electrocuting lightning. I remembered the 2 hours on the unique banks at the confluence of the rivers Setate and Bar Salam. I remembered the lush trees on the bridges of the major canal in the heart of the green labyrinth of Gazira. And I remembered Hantub Secondary School, now the host of the invading Janjaweed and the Nights of Insomnia. I remembered the University of Khartoum, the main road, the GLT lecture theatre, gate to the university, and the Ander Lab gatherings. I remembered the University of Jazeera and Block 7. I remembered the breeze on the unique lonely banks of the river of Atbara, and that on the white coasts of the Mediterranean. I didn't notice myself and the journey's length on the street near Port Sudan Mawani Hospital until I found myself leaning against one of the light poles with my shirt soaked in tears. 2 days later, I was in the arrival hall at Entebbe Airport of Uganda, and Ike, a fasting person, celebrating his holy month. I had two joys: the safe arrival of my mother and family, and meeting my sister coming from Sweden, who managed to provide us with all the comforts and accommodations. Apart from that, there was only gathering sorrow. 2 days later, I summoned all the pillars of hope within me and all that I knew about my country's history. I summoned all the bird seasons and the epics of sacrifice to write a paper I called What to Do, and before that, what you are reading now. And so was this story of pain, the story of fire on the green banks, the story of what happened to Salma, Mohammed, Khalid, Ayman, and Montasser, the comrades of the last day of the Mobile Rural Clinic in pre- and para-war Sudan. And so was also the story of agony, the story of individuals from my own family, my mother, my sisters, and brothers, leaving behind a home, a family, and a country, and flashes of the stories of those whom I met on the paths of displacement. As I write these final lines, I have a heartfelt plea for God's sake. Do not let this story end here. It must not be allowed to conclude this way, yielding to what the warlords wanted us to become. My plea is for this story and others like it to be the beginning, the birth of new and lasting hope. The first step towards walking that path is to answer this burning question: what can we do? For that reason, I invite you to continue and read the post that attempts to answer this question by clicking the link shown in the screen. Thank you. This is Mohammed Khalil Al-Karib,